Marriage exists to create fatherhood. Other benefits are rightly claimed for marriage by its advocates, but in the end, the central one is this: to establish fatherhood. That statement may seem counterintuitive, but it is undeniable. Hello, my name is Stephen Baskerville. The MGTOW phenomenon is on the increase. What is known as men going their own way is difficult to summarize and easy to criticize because it has no formal manifesto or organization or leadership and consists of many views that may conflict with one another. But generally, these are men who are convinced that the justice system is so unjust and that the family courts are so dangerous for them that any contact can only result in their ruin, and that it is therefore better to remain completely independent of women, children, or any family. As an extreme solution, it certainly has the merit of calling attention to an extreme problem. It is difficult to fault them because, factually speaking, their grievances are virtually unexceptionable. Almost all their claims are undeniably correct and irrefutable. A man who marries and has children today can, without any legal wrongdoing on his part, summarily lose those children and much more. He can be forcibly divorced without any grounds, forced out of his home, and not only can his children be summarily confiscated, but so can all his property and even his future earnings. When he has nothing left for the state to plunder, he can then be jailed indefinitely without trial and eventually released on the street, where he invariably joins the ranks of the homeless, most of whom consist of men who have been through similar ordeals. There is no way to avoid this, by the way. The marriage contract is no longer legally binding, and it is not possible to form any legally binding agreement to raise a child in any Western country. Because of no-fault justice, you can be punished without having committed any transgression. Once you have a child, and sometimes even if you don't, you place your life in the hands of government officials with no limits on their power. The response from the media and academia to all this has been a complete blackout. Indeed, for many, the only way to know that MGTOW even exists is to hear privileged journalists and scholars scolding them. They are never, and I mean never, permitted to express their own views in the media or academic literature. This message is directed to the men of MGTOW. I am not here to scold you, but I do hope to offer some constructive suggestions, for I believe that this movement is very important, but without some focus and direction, it can achieve nothing. In fact, it can make the problem much worse. I want to focus on perhaps the most celebrated and criticized MGTOW trend, the boycott of women and marriage. This certainly has the virtue of demonstrating the pointlessness of conservative campaigns to promote marriage. While I believe strongly in marriage, I am not sure that I could, in good conscience, advise a young man or even a young woman to marry today. There are just too many traps laid by a corrupt government machinery. Moreover, what I and others might advise is largely irrelevant, for it is not clear that MGTOW is any kind of organized movement at all, but simply the predictable behavior of men in response to objective circumstances. For it is very clear that men have already embarked on a largely spontaneous and de facto marriage strike, refusing to marry from knowledge of what can happen to them. This is the main cause of the declining birth rate that so agitates conservatives. Yet conservatives refuse to face it, but simply lament and bemoan the trend when they could do something to correct it. And yet, having said all this, I think that the boycott marriage and boycott women response is unwise. As a strategy toward the reform of the divorce laws, I think it is indeed justifiable and can be very effective. But if the aim is to permanently disengage men from marriage as an end in itself, then I think it is seriously misguided. It is bad for society generally, but I think it is also bad for men in particular. I think it will weaken fatherhood in the long run and strengthen its enemies, along with the power of the state. The long-term aim should be to strengthen marriage, not to weaken it. There are many reasons for this, but I want to make the case in terms of what is in the long-term interest of men and fathers, and why men should be the leaders in what is also in the larger interest of women, children, and all of society. It is true that the only certain way to avoid a lawsuit or a jail sentence for some gender crime is to separate oneself entirely from women and children. But I think it is highly unrealistic to believe that men will disengage from women completely. I fear the result will be more extramarital sex and cohabitation and more out-of-wedlock births. I am not just moralizing here. Men who think that so long as they avoid marriage and children, they can have sexual relations with women without problems are deluding themselves. The state has many ways to punish you, even without using the leverage of children. Accusations of rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment, sexual this, and sexual that are increasing daily, as we see in the news. We have already reached the point where not giving money to your wife or girlfriend is being classified legally as punishable abuse. No effective opposition to all this has yet been mounted, and there is no end in sight. We may have eliminated the traditional religious stigmas against sex outside marriage, but the radicals have substituted their own political theology that rationalizes far more draconian criminal penalties. Likewise, many men do want children, even aside from their necessity for society. But men who have children out of wedlock are also making a serious mistake that is contrary to their own interests. The practice of men hiring wombs to produce children that they then raise as single fathers, in effect trying to imitate single mothers, is untenable. If nothing else, child protective services are notoriously hostile to single fathers and can readily move in to confiscate their children. This power, too, will only increase. But there's a deeper reason why men should not write off marriage. Indeed, men should be its main defenders. Marriage exists to create fatherhood. Other benefits are rightly claimed for marriage by its advocates, but in the end, the central one is this: to establish fatherhood. That statement may seem counterintuitive, but it is undeniable. Conservative moralizers who wax eloquent about the virtues of marriage and insist that the purpose of marriage is procreation are only half right. Millions of single mothers attest that procreation is perfectly possible without marriage. This fallacious platitude, usually directed at advocates of same-sex marriage, is easily refuted by pointing out the many heterosexual marriages without children. The purpose of marriage is not procreation, but fatherhood. Marriage allows children to have fathers. Once this is understood, everything else about the current problems of marriage and the family falls into place. And by the way, once this is understood, I think that same-sex marriage is revealed as an absurdity. But this is not the most important point. Marriage is not a gender-neutral institution, nor is it a gender-symmetrical one. It exists to reconcile one of the most basic differences between the sexes, the fact that one sex has an indisputable biological connection to her offspring, whereas the other must have his bond to his children deliberately established by social convention and legal guarantee. This is why, as the late Phyllis Schlafly said, the trends toward non-marriage and toward same-sex marriage are a direct attack on fathers. Marriage turns a man from a sperm donor into a parent. It thus creates paternal authority, allowing a man to exercise the authority over children that would otherwise be exercised by the mother alone. Feminists understand this when they renounce marriage as an institution of patriarchy and promote single motherhood and divorce as positive goods for their own sake. They are methods of empowering women. Instead of recognizing this truth, conservative moralizers labor the cliché that marriage exists to civilize men and control their promiscuity. Perhaps, but if so, this is part of a larger function, to protect the father-child bond and with it the intact family. This point, potentially the strongest in their case, is overlooked by traditionalists who argue that marriage undergirds civilization, for it is the presence of the father that creates both the intact family and, by the same measure, the civil institution itself. For the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, married fatherhood marked nothing less than the transition from natural barbarism to civilization. In The State of Nature, Hobbes argued, quote, "The dominion is in the mother. For in the condition of mere nature, where there are no matrimonial laws, it cannot be known who is the father unless it be declared by the mother. And therefore the right of dominion over the child dependeth on her and is consequently hers." End quote. So, only in civilized society, where matrimonial laws do operate, is authority over children shared with the father. In fact, for all the complex debates delineating the proper role of the state in marriage, the only truly essential role of the state in marriage is to guarantee the rights and authority of parents, and especially the father. Yet in recent years, the state has been doing precisely the opposite. This shows why the divorce revolution is much more subversive of the social order than merely excessive individualism. Liberalized divorce was rationalized in the name of greater freedom, but in reality it is a highly authoritarian attack on an institution that provides for freedom, and it allows radical ideologues and government functionaries to rationalize the most intrusive and repressive government machinery ever created in the English-speaking democracies. The brunt of that repression is felt by men. Our legal system has long insisted that marriage, not sperm, designates the father. The legal standard was Lord Mansfield's rule, stipulating that a child born within wedlock is presumed to be that of the husband. This enabled the marriage to survive the wife's adultery, because earlier ages had a more balanced assessment of the female and male tendencies toward promiscuity. Today, the divorce machinery has perverted this principle to the precise opposite of its intention. The original purpose was to give the cuckolded husband the option of raising the child of an interloper as his own, in order to allow the marriage to remain intact and the child to have a father and a mother. Under pressure from the empowered feminists and mercenary bar associations of the divorce industry, the principle has been twisted to force victims of paternity fraud to pay child support for children that are not theirs. A legal principle intended to hold families together has been manipulated into an added incentive to tear them apart. So, far from protecting the father-child bond, marriage law today rends it apart whenever possible. But the solution is to restore the integrity of marriage law, not to eliminate marriage altogether. As a political strategy, boycotting marriage until the integrity of marriage law is restored makes some sense. As a long-term solution for men or society, it makes no sense. It will only give the state more excuses to augment its own power over fathers, mothers, children, and all of us. The bottom line is that men alone are the ones held responsible. This has always been the case, and it always will be. Complaining about it, or even trying to change it, will only bring more contempt upon men. Men cannot retreat. The only solution is that men must lead. My name is Stephen Baskerville, and you'll find these points documented in my two most recent books, Taken into Custody and The New Politics of Sex.